The real history of the Aztecs, the people without a homeland. Long before stone temples rose from the waters of Lake Texcoco, before drums echoed across causeways and warriors marched beneath banners of hummingbirds and jaguars, the people who become known as the Aztecs were outsiders. They did not begin as rulers. They began as wanderers. According to their own histories, the Mexican people emerged from a distant, half-mythical homeland called Aztlan, a place of reeds, water, and origin. Whether Aztlan was a physical location or a symbolic memory no longer mattered. What mattered was belief. The Mexica believed they had been chosen by their god Huitzilopochtli, a fierce solar and war deity who demanded movement, struggle, and sacrifice. Unlike settled civilizations, the Mexica identity was forged on the road. They migrated southward for generations, carrying their god's image, enduring hunger, rejection, and humiliation. Established city-states of central Mexico saw them as crude, dangerous nomads, useful only as mercenaries or laborers. They were denied land, mocked for their customs, and pushed into the least desirable territories. Yet exile hardened them. Each rejection reinforced a belief that suffering was not accidental. It was divinely necessary. In Mexico thought, the universe itself survived only through struggle. The sun moved because it was fed. Order existed because chaos was resisted. Survival was never guaranteed. By the time the Mexica reached the Valley of Mexico in the late 13th century, the region was already crowded with powerful city-states. Texcoco, Tlacopan, and above all, Azcapotzalco. The Mexica had no political leverage, no territory, and no allies. What they had was discipline and a prophecy. Huitzilopochtli had promised them a sign, an eagle perched upon a cactus, devouring a serpent. Until that sign appeared, they were forbidden to settle. For years, they lived on the margins, swamps, islands, and reed beds others refused to inhabit. Disease was common. Food was scarce. Their children were born into instability. But this harsh environment taught them adaptability. They learned to farm on water. They learned to fight with precision. They learned obedience to command and endurance under pressure. In 1325, they saw the sign. On a small island in Lake Texcoco, an eagle stood upon a nopal cactus, wings spread wide, tearing into its prey. For the Mexica, this was not metaphor. This was divine instruction. They built their city there. They called it Tenochtitlan. At first, it was nothing more than huts, mud platforms, and makeshift canals. But symbolically, it was everything. The Mexica had not chosen a land. The gods had. From this moment forward, their survival was no longer optional. Failure would mean cosmic betrayal. Yet even after founding Tenochtitlan, they remained politically subordinate. They were forced to pay tribute to stronger powers, especially the Tepanec rulers of Azcapotzalco. Mexico warriors fought in other men's wars. Their sacrifices fed foreign gods as often as their own. But this humiliation carried a hidden advantage. By serving as mercenaries, the Mexica studied warfare intimately. They learned enemy tactics, alliance politics, and the psychology of fear. They observed how tribute systems worked, and how resentment grew beneath them. While others ruled comfortably, the Mexica prepared. At the heart of their preparation was religion. Aztec religion was not symbolic. It was operational. The cosmos was believed to be fragile, having already been destroyed 4 times before. The current age, the fifth sun, would collapse unless continuously nourished by human blood and hearts. This belief transformed violence into obligation. War was not merely conquest. It was maintenance of reality. Young boys were trained early. Education was mandatory, rare in the ancient world. Even commoners learned discipline, endurance, and religious duty. Nobles learned rhetoric, astronomy, and leadership. All were taught that personal suffering strengthened the universe. This worldview produced something dangerous, a population psychologically prepared for sacrifice, both giving and receiving. By the early 15th century, cracks appeared in the regional power structure. The death of Tepanec leadership triggered political instability. The Mexica seized a moment. Through rebellion, strategic marriages, and alliances, most notably with Texcoco, they overthrew their former masters. The outcasts became rulers. The Triple Alliance was born, and Tenochtitlan emerged not merely as a city, but as the center of a new imperial order. Tribute flowed in cacao, jade, cotton captives. The Mexica god demanded expansion, and expansion justified his worship. But even at the height of power, the memory of exile never faded. The Aztecs ruled like people who believed the universe was watching and waiting for failure, engineering power from the impossible. Tenochtitlan was never meant to exist. The island where the Mexica chose to settle was swampy, unstable, and surrounded by brackish water. Seasonal flooding turned solid ground into mud. Fresh water was limited. Stone had to be transported by canoe. Any conventional city builder would have rejected the location immediately. But the Mexica did not think like conventional people. They believed difficulty was confirmation. The more hostile the environment, the more certain they were a divine favor. Survival itself was proof that Huitzilopochtli still demanded their endurance. So they reshaped the land. Through relentless labor, the Mexica transformed Lake Texcoco into a controlled landscape of canals, causeways, dikes, and floating agricultural beds called chinampas. These artificial islands, constructed from mud, reeds, and vegetation, were anchored to the lakebed and irrigated naturally. The result was one of the most productive farming systems in the pre-modern world. Maize, beans, squash, chili, tomatoes, and flowers grew year-round. While European cities struggled with sanitation and food shortages, Tenochtitlan fed a population that would eventually exceed 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities on Earth in the early 16th century. Waterways replaced streets. Canoes moved goods, people, and tribute through a vast commercial network. Markets operated daily, with Tlatelolco's central market handling tens of thousands of traders at once. Everything had value. Everything had order. This was not chaos. This was engineered power. At the city's center rose a sacred precinct, dominated by the Templo Mayor, a massive step pyramid crowned by twin shrines. One was dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the sun, the other to Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility, war and sustenance, death and life. Their placement was deliberate. The Aztecs believed balance was maintained through opposition. To favor one force without the other invited collapse. Surrounding the temples were schools, armories, priestly residences, and ritual spaces. Every architectural decision reflected cosmology. The city itself was a model of the universe, divided into 4 quarters aligned with the cardinal directions, with the sacred precinct at its heart. To live in Tenochtitlan was to live inside a living myth. Politically, however, the Mexicas still faced a challenge: legitimacy. They were newcomers. Other city-states had older lineages, deeper cultural prestige, and established ruling dynasties. To compensate, the Mexica turned to control brutality and ritual spectacle. Power had to be seen, felt, and feared. Public ceremonies were massive. Processions lasted days. Music, incense, blood, and chanting fused into overwhelming sensory experiences. Captives were sacrificed not in secrecy, but in open ritual, reinforcing the message that the gods favored Mexica dominance. Yet this was not random cruelty. Captives were often treated with ritual respect before sacrifice. Some were fed, dressed, even honored, because their death was meaningful. A sacrifice without cosmic purpose was useless. Blood was currency. The heart was fuel. This belief system shaped warfare. Aztec battles were not designed solely to kill. They were designed to capture. Warriors advanced with the goal of taking enemies alive for ritual use. Success in battle was measured by prisoners, not body counts. Prestige followed those who brought captives back to the temples. This created a warrior elite defined by discipline, restraint, and ritual obedience. Social mobility existed, but only through achievement. A commoner who captured enough prisoners could rise in status. Nobility without martial success meant little. Honor had to be earned repeatedly. Education reinforced the structure. Children attended schools based on social class, but discipline was universal. Punishments were severe. Laziness was corrected early. Boys were taught endurance, humility, and obedience. Girls learned domestic skills, ritual responsibilities, and moral conduct. Both were taught that personal desire came second to cosmic duty. This created a population accustomed to authority and sacrifice. By the mid-15th century, under rulers like Itzcoatl and Moctezuma I, the Mexica rewrote history itself. Older records were destroyed. New narratives were commissioned. Stories that framed the Mexica as divinely chosen, inevitable rulers of central Mexico. History became propaganda. Through conquest and alliance, the Triple Alliance, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, expanded rapidly. Tribute lists grew longer. Entire regions were reorganized around the needs of the capital. Goods flowed inward, power concentrated upward. But this success carried a hidden cost. Conquered city-states were rarely integrated. They were dominated, taxed, and intimidated, but not absorbed. Local rulers remained in place, simmering with resentment. Tribute demands grew heavier. Ritual sacrifice often used captives from these subject regions, turning religious obligation into political humiliation. The empire expanded faster than loyalty could form. From the causeways of Tenochtitlan, the city appeared invincible, its temples gleaming, its canals alive with commerce, its priests reading the stars with confidence. But beyond the lake, hatred quietly accumulated. The Mexica had built a city that defied nature. They had not yet learned that empires collapse not from weakness, but from the weight of what they demand. Society of order, class, discipline, and the machinery of control. Aztec power did not rest solely on armies or temples. It rested on structure. Beneath the towering pyramids and ritual spectacle existed a tightly regulated society where nearly every individual knew their place, their duty, and the consequences of failure. The Aztec Empire functioned not because chaos was suppressed, but because order was internalized. From birth, an Aztec child was assigned to a calpulli, a kin-based community unit that served as a foundation of social life. The calpulli distributed land, organized labor, collected tribute, and provided education. Loyalty to one's calpulli came before loyalty to distant rulers. This local cohesion allowed the empire to scale without collapsing inward, yet equality did not exist. Aztec society was rigidly hierarchical. At the top stood the Tlatoani, the emperor, literally the one who speaks. He was not a god, but he was believed to be chosen by divine will. His authority combined political leadership, military command, and religious responsibility. A weak Tlatoani was not merely ineffective. He was dangerous to the cosmic order. Below him stood the Pipiltin, the noble class. Nobles served as generals, priests, judges, and administrators. They wore distinct clothing, lived in stone houses, and received advanced education. But nobility alone was not enough. A noble who failed in war could lose status. Honor was fragile, constantly tested. The majority of the population were Massahualtin, commoners, farmers, artisans, builders, porters. They worked the chinampas, constructed temples, and filled the markets. Their lives were difficult, but not without dignity. Commoners could own land, marry freely, and appeal to courts. In rare cases, exceptional warriors rose from this class into nobility. At the bottom were Tlacopan, slaves. But Aztec slavery was unlike the chattel slavery of later centuries. Slaves were often debtors, criminals, or captives. They could own property, marry, and even buy their freedom. Their children were born free. Slavery was a condition, not a permanent identity. This nuance reflected a larger Aztec belief. Status was mutable, but duty was constant. Law reinforced this worldview with brutal clarity. Aztec legal codes were strict and publicly enforced. Theft, adultery, drunkenness, outside ritual contexts, and disobedience could result in severe punishment, beatings, enslavement, or death. Judges were expected to be impartial. Corruption was punished harshly, even among elites. Justice was not compassionate. It was corrective. Public order mattered more than individual circumstance. In a society that believed cosmic collapse was always imminent, discipline was survival. Education was compulsory, another rarity in the ancient world. Boys attended either the Telpacali for commoners or the Calmecac for nobles. In the Telpacali, boys learned physical endurance, military discipline, obedience, and humility. They carried firewood, trained with weapons, and were punished severely for arrogance. In the Kalmakak, noble youths studied astronomy, theology, rhetoric, history, and leadership. Priests were trained here. Men expected to master fasting, self-mortification, and ritual precision. Mistakes during ceremonies were believed to anger the gods. Girls were educated separately but seriously. They learned weaving, cooking, household management, and ritual responsibilities. Women were expected to embody moral stability. While warfare defined masculinity, childbirth defined female heroism. A woman who died in childbirth was honored like a fallen warrior, believed to accompany the sun in its journey. This belief reveals a crucial truth. Aztec society did not glorify violence blindly. It sacralized struggle. Every role, farmer, warrior, mother, priest, was framed as a form of sacrifice. The universe demanded effort, pain, and discipline. Comfort was suspicious. Excess invited decay. Markets reinforced this order daily. Tlatelolco's market was regulated by officials who enforced prices, standards, and fairness. Judges walked among stalls. Cheating was punished publicly. Cocoa beans functioned as currency. Everything, from obsidian blades to feathers, food, clothing, and slaves, was traded openly. The market was not chaos. It was controlled exchange. Religion penetrated every layer of life. There was no separation between sacred and secular. Every calendar date carried spiritual significance. Every festival demanded participation. Priests interpreted omens constantly, eclipses, comets, unusual births. Fear was not hidden. It was instructional. The Aztecs believed the gods communicated through disaster. Floods, droughts, disease, these were signs of imbalance. When things went wrong, society looked inward. Someone had failed. A ritual had been neglected. A sacrifice had been insufficient. This belief system created extraordinary social cohesion, but also extreme pressure. Individuals lived knowing that personal failure might endanger everyone. As the empire expanded, this internal discipline allowed Tenochtitlan to manage enormous populations efficiently, but it also created emotional distance between rulers and the ruled. Subject peoples were forced into the system without sharing its cosmology. Tribute became coercion rather than duty. Order without belief breeds resentment. The Aztec state was precise, powerful, and uncompromising. It produced stability, productivity, and awe. But beneath its perfection lay tension between obedience and exhaustion, faith and fear, unity and imposed control. The machinery of empire was running smoothly, and like all machines, it demanded constant fuel, gods of hunger, blood, sacrifice, in a fragile universe. To understand the Aztecs, one must abandon the modern idea that religion exists separately from reality. For the Aztecs, religion was reality. The universe, as they understood it, was not stable. It was not benevolent. It had already been destroyed 4 times before. Each previous age, each previous sun, had ended in catastrophe. Flood, fire, wind, darkness. The current age, the 5th sun, was no exception. It survived only because the gods had sacrificed themselves to set it in motion. And now, the burden of that sacrifice had passed to humanity. If humans failed to repay that debt, the sun would stop moving. Time would end. Reality would collapse. This belief was not symbolic. It was urgent. At the center of Aztec cosmology stood Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war. He was not a distant creator deity. He was a being locked in eternal struggle, fighting darkness every dawn, pushing the sun across the sky through sheer force. Each sunrise was a victory, each sunset a warning. Without blood, Huitzilopochtli would weaken, and if he weakened, the world would die. Alongside him stood Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. Tlaloc was feared as much as he was worshipped. He controlled not only rain, but disease, drought, and agricultural collapse. His favor meant abundance. His anger meant starvation. These gods did not offer moral comfort. They demanded maintenance. The Aztecs believed the body contained Teolia, a vital essence concentrated in the heart. When the heart was offered to gods, this energy was released and fed the cosmos. Blood was not symbolic life. It was literal fuel. This is why sacrifice was public, ritualized, and precise. Victims were prepared carefully. They were often bathed, dressed, and instructed in ritual behavior. On the steps of the Templo Mayor, priests stretched the body backward over a stone altar. An obsidian blade, sharp beyond modern steel, cut through flesh in a single practice motion. The heart was removed while still beating. It was lifted to the sky. The body followed. To modern eyes, this appears as cruelty beyond comprehension. But within Aztec logic, withholding sacrifice was cruelty. Allowing the universe to collapse through negligence was the ultimate sin. Children were sacrificed to Tlaloc during times of drought. Their tears were believed to summon rain. Warriors were sacrificed to Huitzilopochtli because only strong hearts carried sufficient energy. Each god required specific offerings. Each ritual followed ancient prescriptions. Mistakes were dangerous. Priests underwent extreme discipline. They fasted, abstained, pierced their own flesh, and lived under constant ritual restriction. Bloodletting, piercing the tongue, ears, or genitals, was common. Even the elite were expected to bleed for the gods. Sacrifice was not reserved for victims. It was a social expectation. The Aztec calendar reinforced this worldview. The Tanaup Wali, a 260-day ritual calendar, and the Xiapo Wali, a 365-day solar calendar, intersected in complex cycles. Each day carried omens. Each festival demanded proper observance. Every 52 years, these calendars realigned. This moment, called the New Fire Ceremony, was terrifying. The Aztecs believed the world might end during this transition. Fires across the empire were extinguished. People waited in darkness. If the sun rose again, a new fire was lit on the chest of a sacrifice victim. Flames were carried to every household, renewing the world for another cycle. Survival was never guaranteed. This constant proximity to annihilation shaped Aztec psychology deeply. Life was precious because it was fragile. Death was honored because it sustained everything. Fear was not paralyzing. It was motivational. Even gods were not immortal in the way modern religions imagine. Gods could weaken. Gods could starve. Gods could die. This belief erased the boundary between divine and human responsibility. The Aztecs did not pray for salvation. They worked for it. However, the scale of sacrifice grew as the empire expanded. More territory meant more gods to appease, more festivals to observe, more captives required. Public ceremonies grew larger. The Templo Mayor was expanded repeatedly to accommodate increasing ritual demand. With scale came spectacle. Thousands could be sacrificed during major dedications. Drums echoed across the lake. The smell of incense and blood mixed in the air. These events reinforced power, both divine and political. They reminded allies and enemies alike that the Mexica were favored by the gods. But this system carried a fatal vulnerability. It depended on constant expansion. War was no longer just political necessity. It was theological obligation. Captives were needed to keep the sun moving. If expansion stopped, sacrifice slowed. If sacrifice slowed, fear grew. The gods had created an empire that could never rest. Subject peoples were forced into this cycle without sharing its meaning. Their sons became offerings for gods they did not worship. Tribute became blood. Ritual became terror. What the Aztecs saw as cosmic duty, others experienced as existential threat. This growing resentment would one day become weaponized. The gods of the Aztecs demanded everything: discipline, blood, obedience, and endless war. For generations, the Mexica delivered. But the universe they believed they were holding together was already shifting. And the gods were about to be tested by something they had never prepared for. The sacred art of war, warriors, captives, and control violence. To the Aztecs, war was not chaos. It was ceremony. Every battle followed ritual logic shaped by religion, politics, and psychology. Violence was not unleashed. It was managed, directed toward cosmic purpose. Unlike many empires that sought annihilation, the Aztecs sought control, capture, and continuity. War fed the gods, and the gods demanded war. From childhood, Aztec males were prepared for combat. Even before formal military training began, boys carried heavy loads, slept on hard floors, and learned to endure pain without complaint. Discipline mattered more than strength. Obedience mattered more than aggression. The goal was not rage, but restraint. Aztec warfare emphasized capturing enemies alive. Killing an opponent on the battlefield wasted valuable sacrificial energy. A true warrior subdued, restrained, and returned with prisoners. This requirement reshaped everything, from weapons to tactics. Aztec weapons were designed to wound rather than kill. The macuahuitl, a wooden sword edged with razor-sharp obsidian blades, could sever limbs but was often used to incapacitate. Spears, darts, and clubs were wielded to overwhelm and entangle rather than slaughter. Battles unfolded with formal signals, banners, and drums. Armies identified themselves clearly. Surprise attacks were less valued than demonstrated dominance. The battlefield was as much theater as it was combat. Victory was measured not by territory seized, but by captives taken. Warriors advanced through ranked military orders. Success brought status, privilege, and identity. The Jaguar warriors and Eagle warriors formed elite units recognizable by their animal-themed armor and headdresses. Their appearance alone projected fear and prestige. A warrior's worth was visible. Capturing 4 enemies in battle granted noble status, even for commoners. Each capture is recorded. Each promotion earned new clothing, hairstyles, and the right to participate in elite rituals. Military success unlocked social mobility. Failure, however, carried shame. Cowardice was despised. Refusing to fight dishonored one's family and Kalpuli. In extreme cases, cowards could be stripped of status or punished publicly. Honor was collective. Yet Aztec warfare was not perpetual chaos. The empire relied on a unique institution known as the Flower Wars. These were ritualized conflicts arranged between rival states, not to conquer territory, but to capture prisoners for sacrifice. They followed agreed-upon rules. Timing, location, and scale were negotiated. On the surface, Flower Wars appear paradoxical, organized violence for religious maintenance. But strategically, they served multiple purposes. They provided military training. They maintained a steady supply of captives. And they reinforced hierarchies without destabilizing the region. They also revealed something critical. The Aztecs were not always expanding. At times, war existed simply to sustain belief. As the empire grew, real conquest wars became more common. Cities that resisted tribute faced overwhelming force. Aztec armies moved with logistical precision, supplied by tributary networks and supported by allied forces. Defeated cities were given a choice: submit and pay tribute, or be destroyed and sacrificed. Most submitted, but submission was never quality. Tribute lists were strict and unforgiving. Cotton, maize, cacao, jade, feathers, rubber, and captives were demanded regularly. Failure to deliver brought punishment. The system enriched Tenochtitlan, but bred resentment everywhere else. Warriors returning with captives participated in elaborate rituals. Prisoners were often kept alive for weeks or months, integrated into ceremonial cycles. Some were treated with ritual respect. Others were paraded publicly as symbols of dominance. For the warrior, this was a culmination of duty. For the captive, it was fate. Sacrifice was not seen as humiliation, but transformation. The captured warrior was believed to achieve a form of honor through death. Some were told they would accompany the sun or serve the gods. Whether captives believed this is another question. What mattered was that Aztec society believed it. War shaped gender roles as well. While men fought external enemies, women fought internal battles, childbirth being the most dangerous. A woman who died giving birth was honored like a fallen warrior. Her spirit was believed to escort the sun at dawn. Violence and creation were linked. Even art reflected warfare. Murals, carvings, and codices depicted battles, captives, and ritual deaths. These images were not meant to shock. They were meant to instruct. This is who we are. This is how the world survives. But the system had limits. As the empire expanded, enemies became more numerous and more hostile. Flower wars, once controlled, began to resemble real conflict. Subject peoples grew less compliant. Tribute demands increased. Captives became harder to obtain. The Aztec war machine required constant motion. If it slowed, the gods would starve. And in this dependency lay the empire's greatest weakness. Because when a new kind of war arrived, one that killed without capture, without ritual, without cosmic meaning. The Aztec system would struggle to respond. War for the Aztecs was sacred art. Soon, it would become something else entirely. Tribute and expansion, the illusion of absolute power. At its height, the Aztec Empire appeared unshakable. From the canals of Tenochtitlan, power radiated outward across mountains, valleys, and coasts. Tribute flowed inward in endless streams: food, luxury goods, raw materials, and human lives. The empire did not merely conquer land, it extracted obligation. Yet the true strength of the Aztec state was also its greatest deception. The empire was not unified. It was managed. The Aztecs ruled through a system of indirect control. Conquered city-states were rarely dismantled. Their local rulers remained in place, governing their people according to traditional customs, so long as tribute was delivered on time and loyalty was displayed publicly. This approach allowed rapid expansion without administrative overload, but it also ensured that allegiance was shallow. Tribute was the lifeblood of the empire. Codices meticulously recorded obligations: how much maize, cotton, cacao, rubber, feathers, obsidian, jade, and captives each province owed. Tribute collectors enforced compliance with little flexibility. Missed payments were interpreted as rebellion. Punishment was swift. Military expeditions were launched not only to conquer new territories, but to remind old ones of their place. Cities that resisted were made examples of. Their leaders were executed or sacrificed. Their people were enslaved or relocated. The message was clear: compliance ensured survival. Resistance ensured obliteration. This system enriched Tenochtitlan beyond imagination. Nobles wore rare feathers and jade. Priests presided over increasingly elaborate rituals. Markets overflowed with goods from distant regions: coastal shells, tropical birds, cacao beans from the south. But this wealth masked a dangerous truth. The empire's prosperity depended on constant outward pressure. Tribute demands grew as ritual needs expanded. Each new festival required more offerings. Each temple expansion required more labor. Each military victory raised expectations. The empire could never stabilize. Even allies were not equals. Within the Triple Alliance, power increasingly concentrated in Tenochtitlan. Texcoco and Tlacopan received shares of tribute, but decisions flowed from Mexico rulers. Over time, resentment grew even among partners. Internally, the ruling elite became more distant from the common people. Nobles lived in comfort, while commoners labored harder to meet imperial demands. Social mobility still existed, but it narrowed as warfare intensified and opportunities became more dangerous. The psychological burden of empire grew heavier. For subject peoples, Aztec rule was not framed as shared destiny, but as extraction. They did not participate in Aztec cosmology willingly. Their sons were taken as captives. Their gods were tolerated only when subordinated. Their festivals were overshadowed by Mexican rituals. This created an empire held together by fear, not loyalty. Aztec rulers understood this and believed fear was sufficient. Their worldview did not prioritize unity. It prioritized function. As long as tribute flowed and captives arrived, the gods were fed. The empire endured. Yet the system ignored one crucial factor: memory. Every sacrifice created a grievance. Every tribute demand reinforced humiliation. Every punitive expedition planted the seed of revenge. These memories accumulated silently across the empire's borders. The Aztecs mistook silence for obedience. Meanwhile, expansion brought the empire into contact with increasingly resistant cultures. Peoples less willing to submit, more skilled at guerrilla tactics, and more familiar with prolonged resistance. War became more costly. Casualties increased. Captives became harder to secure. The empire responded by demanding more. This cycle could not continue indefinitely. From the perspective of Tenochtitlan, the empire looked eternal. Temples rose higher. Ritual calendars remained precise. The sun continued to rise. But beyond the lake, the empire's image was different. The Aztecs were feared but also hated. And when a small group of foreign outsiders arrived on the eastern coast, carrying unfamiliar weapons, exploiting old resentments and offering an alternative to Aztec dominance. The illusion of absolute power would shatter faster than anyone in Tenochtitlan could imagine. The Aztec Empire had conquered the known world around it. It had not prepared for the unknown. Inside the empire, daily life, markets, and survival. For most Aztecs, empire was not experienced through conquest or ceremony. It was experienced through routine. Long before sunrise, smoke rose from household hearths. Women ground maize on stone metates, preparing dough for tortillas and tamales. Men set out toward chinampas, workshops, construction sites, or markets. Children carried water, gathered firewood, or attended school. Life was structured, repetitive, and demanding. Aztec homes reflected social status, but shared common features. Most families lived in single-story adobe houses with thatched or flat roofs. Even nobles' homes emphasized function over comfort. Furnishings were minimal. Beds were mats. Privacy was limited. Excess was discouraged. Food formed the center of daily existence. Maize was a foundation, eaten as tortillas, gruel, or tamales. Beans, squash, chilies, tomatoes, and amaranth supplemented diets. Meat was rare for commoners, usually limited to insects, fish, dogs, or birds. Chocolate, made from cacao, was reserved for elites and ritual contexts. Hunger was familiar, but starvation was uncommon within the capital, thanks to Chinampa agriculture and tribute flows. Markets were the heart of Aztec daily life. The market at Tlatelolco operated every day, with major market days drawing tens of thousands of people. Merchants sold food, tools, pottery, clothing, feathers, obsidian blades, medicinal herbs, and luxury items. Slaves were also bought and sold openly. Prices were regulated. Officials monitored transactions. Judges settled disputes on the spot. This was not informal trade. It was a regulated economic engine. Cacao beans functioned as currency. So did cotton cloth and small gold objects. Fraud was punished severely. Trust in the market was essential to social stability. Trade networks extended far beyond the empire's borders. Professional merchants known as Paktika traveled vast distances, sometimes acting as spies and diplomats. They gathered intelligence on foreign lands, assessed potential threats, and mapped future conquest opportunities. Merchants were wealthy, but carefully watched. Family life was disciplined and moralized. Marriage was expected. Matchmakers arranged unions based on compatibility and social standing. Divorce was permitted but discouraged. Fidelity was enforced, especially among women. Adultery could be punished by death. Children were raised strictly. Parents disciplined them harshly, believing that indulgence weakened character. Laziness, disobedience, and arrogance were corrected early, sometimes with physical punishment or exposure to hardship. Education reinforced social values. Festivals punctuated the year, offering moments of communal release. Music, dance, feasting, and ritual intoxication were permitted during designated celebrations. Outside these moments, public drunkenness was forbidden and punished. Joy was regulated. Health and medicine blended practical knowledge with spiritual belief. Aztec healers used herbs, massage, steam baths, and surgery. They also consulted omens, prayers, and rituals. Illness was often interpreted as spiritual imbalance rather than biological malfunction. Death was omnipresent but not hidden. Funerals were ritualized. Bodies were cremated or buried with offerings. The manner of death determined the afterlife. Warriors and women who died in childbirth followed the sun. Drowned victims went to Tlaloc's paradise. Ordinary deaths led to Mictlan, a shadowy underworld reached after a long journey. Daily life unfolded beneath constant religious awareness. Omens were watched closely. Dreams were interpreted. Unusual events were reported to priests. Time itself was sacred. Certain days were lucky. Others were dangerous. People planned births, marriages, and journeys according to the calendar. Despite hardship, Aztec life was not bleak. There was laughter, family affection, pride in craft, and satisfaction in duty. People believed their struggles mattered. Yet beneath this order lay anxiety. Tribute demands increased. Military conscription intensified. More captives were needed. Festivals grew bloodier. Rumors spread of distant unrest. Subject peoples grew bolder in their defiance. Commoners felt the pressure first. Life inside the empire remained structured, but increasingly strained. And soon, daily routines would be shattered by events no calendar had prepared them for: law, power, and psychology of rule. The Aztec Empire was not held together by love, shared identity, or consent. It was held together by fear, ritualized authority, and the constant demonstration of consequence. Law was not abstract. It was visible, immediate, and brutal. Justice in Aztec society operated at multiple levels, but all flowed upward toward the emperor. Local judges handled common disputes: land boundaries, theft, debt, and family conflicts. Higher courts dealt with nobles, serious crimes, and appeals. Above all stood the Tenochtitlan, whose word carried the weight of divine approval. Corruption was punished harshly. A judge who accepted a bribe could be executed. An official who abused authority faced public humiliation or death. The system demanded severity to preserve legitimacy. Punishment was meant to be seen. Crimes carried fixed penalties. Theft, even of small items, could result in slavery or execution, especially during famine. Adultery was a capital crime for both men and women. Drunkenness among the young or nobles could lead to death. False testimony, slander, and sorcery accusations were treated seriously. There was little room for mercy. Public executions reinforced order. Condemned individuals were paraded bound and killed in ways that emphasized moral failure. The purpose was not cruelty alone. It was instruction. Everyone watching learned the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Fear functioned as governance. The emperor's authority was absolute but not casual. Ascension to the throne required confirmation by nobles, priests, and military leaders. Once crowned, the Tenochtitlan embodied the will of the gods. Disobedience was not political dissent. It was sacrilege. Yet the emperor was also bound by expectation. He was required to wage war, expand territory, secure tribute, and provide captives for sacrifice. A weak or unlucky ruler risked deposition or assassination. Power was sacred, but conditional. Beneath the emperor stood a rigid hierarchy. Nobles enjoyed privileges but lived under constant scrutiny. Their failures were punished more severely than those of commoners. A noble caught stealing faced execution. A commoner might be enslaved. Rank increased responsibility and danger. The military served as both instrument of conquest and social mobility. Capturing enemies alive earned prestige, wealth, and advancement. Success on the battlefield could elevate a commoner into noble status. Failure invited disgrace. War was not chaos. It was regulated violence. Legal institutions reinforced cultural psychology. Children learned obedience through fear of consequence. Adults internalized boundaries. Social shame was as powerful as law. Reputation mattered deeply. Public dishonor could ruin families for generations. This produced outward stability, but inward tension. Religious law overlapped civil law. Priests interpreted omens and enforced ritual obligations. Missing a required ceremony, mishandling sacred objects, or disrespecting temples could result in severe punishment. Time itself enforced law. Certain days were forbidden for travel or labor. Violating calendrical rules was dangerous, not just legally, but cosmically. The empire governed behavior by embedding fear into daily life. Yet law also offered protection. Property rights were recognized. Markets were regulated. Violence within communities was controlled. For many, strict order was preferable to chaos. Justice was harsh, but predictable. Psychologically, Aztec rule cultivated acceptance of suffering as necessary. Pain had meaning. Death had purpose. Sacrifice, whether of blood, labor, or life, was the price of cosmic balance. This worldview normalized extreme obedience. However, it also bred resentment. Subject peoples bore heavy tribute burdens. Local elites were humiliated. Rebellions were crushed publicly and ritualized. Entire cities watched their leaders sacrifice atop temples. These acts sent a message that traveled faster than armies. Fear maintained the empire, but fear also eroded loyalty. By the early 16th century, cracks were visible. Enforcement intensified. Punishments became more theatrical. Laws grew stricter. The need to assert control revealed growing instability. An empire confident in itself does not need constant reminders of power. The Aztec state had become a machine that required continual violence to function, and machines like that eventually face a moment when fear is no longer enough. That moment was approaching, carried across the sea by forces no law, god, or calendar had anticipated. Omens, prophecy, and the year the gods fell silent. Long before foreign ships appeared on the horizon, the Aztecs believed the end had already begun. Aztec civilization lived beneath the weight of prophecy. Time was cyclical, not linear. Worlds had been created and destroyed before, each ending in catastrophe. The present age, the fifth sun, was not permanent. It would fall like the others. The only uncertainty was when. By the early 16th century, signs seemed to multiply. Strange omens were reported across the empire. Chroniclers later recorded 8 great portents said to have appeared during the reign of Moctezuma II. Whether exaggerated by hindsight or genuinely believed at the time, these signs shaped perception and decision-making at the highest levels of power. A column of fire appeared in the night sky and burned for a year. The temple of Huitzilopochtli reportedly caught fire without cause. A comet streaked across the heavens. Waters around Tenochtitlan boiled and flooded the city. A woman's voice was heard weeping in the night, crying for her lost children. Most disturbing of all was a creature said to resemble a 2-headed bird, brought before the emperor. In its mirror-like eyes, Moctezuma was said to have seen armed men riding strange beasts. These were not dismissed as coincidence. Aztec rulers governed in constant dialogue with priests and diviners. Omens were interpreted through ritual calendars, dreams, and sacrifice. When signs accumulated, they demanded response, not denial. Moctezuma, too, was deeply religious, introspective, and cautious. Unlike his warrior predecessors, he ruled as a ceremonial emperor, emphasizing ritual purity and divine legitimacy. The omens struck him not as warnings, but confirmations. The gods were unsettled. Adding to the anxiety was the ancient legend of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity associated with creation, knowledge, and order. According to some traditions, Quetzalcoatl had once ruled as a priest-king and promised a return from the east. Whether this myth truly shaped Moctezuma's actions has been debated for centuries. But what is clear is that the emperor believed the cosmic balance was fragile, and that history itself might be turning against him. When reports arrived of floating mountains appearing off the eastern coast in 1519, panic spread through the court. Messengers described towering wooden structures with white wings, carrying men with pale faces, metal skins, and thunder weapons. They arrived not as traders, but as beings entirely outside known categories. Moctezuma did not order immediate war. Instead, he hesitated. Gifts were sent: gold, feathers, cloth, and ritual objects, intended both as diplomacy and appeasement. The emperor sought to learn whether these visitors were mortal enemies or divine agents. This hesitation would prove catastrophic. The Spaniards, led by Hernán Cortés, interpreted the gifts not as caution, but as submission. Each offering confirmed their belief that they had entered a wealthy, fractured empire ripe for conquest. Within Aztec leadership, confusion deepened. Priests disagreed on interpretation. Some urged immediate annihilation. Others warned that killing divine emissaries could trigger cosmic collapse. The empire paused while its enemies advanced. Psychologically, the Aztecs were trapped between 2 incompatible frameworks. Their worldview demanded reverence for signs and obedience to prophecy, but survival now required rapid adaptation to an unprecedented threat. No ritual existed for this moment. As Cortés marched inland, allied with long-oppressed tributary states, the cracks in Aztec authority widened. Cities that had once feared Tenochtitlan now saw opportunity. Old resentments turned into open rebellion. The gods, it seemed, were no longer speaking clearly. Moctezuma's isolation intensified. He withdrew from public appearances. Rituals increased in frequency and severity. Sacrifices multiplied, not to celebrate victory, but to delay disaster. Yet nothing slowed the march of events. When the Spaniards finally entered Tenochtitlan, they were awed by its scale and order. Causeways stretched across the lake. Markets overflowed with goods. Temples rose above the city like mountains. But beneath the surface, uncertainty ruled. Moctezuma welcomed Cortez into the heart of the empire, an act that stunned later generations, whether driven by fear, diplomacy, or belief in destiny. The decision marked a moment when prophecy became reality. The gods did not intervene. No fire fell from the sky. No earthquake shattered the invaders. No divine army rose from the temples. Silence replaced certainty. The Aztec worldview had always promised meaning. Suffering justified by cosmic order. Sacrifice rewarded by continuation. Now, meaning fractured. The old rituals no longer guaranteed control. The empire stood at the edge of transformation, not just political, but existential. The age of the fifth sun was trembling, and the fall once foretold was about to begin, not through divine fire, but through steel, disease, betrayal, and human fear. Steel, horses, and the collapse of balance. The arrival of the Spaniards did not shatter the Aztec world immediately. At first, it unbalanced it. Hernán Cortés entered central Mexico not as a conqueror, but as an opportunist navigating a fragile political landscape. He commanded only a few hundred Spanish soldiers. What gave him power was not numbers. It was technology, psychology, and alliances. The Aztecs had never seen horses. To them, horse and rider appeared as a single creature, fast, loud, and terrifying. Steel armor deflected obsidian blades. Swords cut through cotton armor with ease. Cannons and arquebuses produced smoke and thunder that echoed like divine weapons. Yet these tools alone could not have destroyed the empire. The true weapon was division. For decades, the Aztecs had ruled through domination. Subject cities paid heavy tribute in food, labor, textiles, and captives. Resentment simmered beneath enforced obedience. When Cortés arrived, many saw him not as a threat, but as leverage. The Totonacs were among the first to ally with the Spaniards. Others followed, most notably the Tlaxcalans, longtime enemies of the Aztecs who had resisted conquest for generations. After initial battles, Tlaxcala recognized opportunity. They chose revenge over fear. What followed was not a Spanish invasion, but a coalition uprising with European leadership. Indigenous armies outnumbered Spaniards by tens of thousands. Cortés became the spearhead of a war driven by local grievances. Meanwhile, Moctezuma hesitated. He allowed the Spaniards into Tenochtitlan and housed them within the palace complex. This decision, intended as diplomacy or containment, proved fatal. Cortés took the emperor hostage, ruling indirectly through him. The unthinkable had happened. The Tlatoani, the living representative of divine authority, was now a prisoner. Ritual hierarchy collapsed. Political legitimacy fractured. Obedience became confusion. Moctezuma attempted to calm his people, speaking on behalf of the Spaniards. Instead of restoring order, his words destroyed trust. He was no longer seen as protector, but as compromised. Violence followed inevitably. During a religious festival, Spanish forces massacred unarmed celebrants within the great temple precinct. Blood flooded sacred ground. The city erupted. Uprising engulfed Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma died soon after. Whether killed by his own people or murdered by the Spaniards remains contested. What mattered was not how he died, but what his death represented. The gods had lost their voice. The Spaniards fled the city under attack in what became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Hundreds were killed. Treasure sank into the lake. For a moment, it seemed the Aztecs might survive, but the balance had already shifted. Smallpox arrived before the Spaniards returned. The disease tore through the population with unprecedented speed. Entire families died within days. Priests, warriors, and leaders fell alike. There was no immunity, no cure, no explanation within existing cosmology. Bodies filled the streets. Ritual calendars meant nothing against invisible death. Leadership passed to Cuitlahuac, then quickly to Cuauhtémoc, a young, determined warrior emperor. He inherited an empire already bleeding. When Cortés returned, he did so with thousands of indigenous allies. Ships dismantled and rebuilt to control the lake, and a population weakened by disease and famine. The siege of Tenochtitlan was relentless. Causeways were cut, water supplies poisoned, food routes severed. The city starved while surrounded by enemies who once feared it. Cuauhtémoc fought to the end. Street by street, Temple by temple, the Aztecs resisted. Warriors continued to fight even as ritual order collapsed. Sacrifice continued amid ruin, not a celebration but desperation. The Spaniards documented the destruction with awe and horror. Tenochtitlan, once among the greatest cities on earth, was reduced to rubble. In 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured. The empire ended not with prophecy fulfilled, but with silence. The temples were torn down. Churches rose in their place. Gold was melted. Codices burned. Gods were declared false. History was rewritten by victors. But the fall of the Aztecs was not simply a military defeat. It was a collapse of an entire worldview. A civilization built on ritual continuity, cosmic balance, and sacred violence could not adapt quickly enough to disease, technology, and betrayal. The very structures that had sustained it, hierarchy, fear, obedience, became weaknesses when flexibility was required. The fifth sun did not end in fire or flood. It ended in steel, sickness, and human choice. And yet, the Aztecs did not vanish. Their descendants survived. Their language endured. Their beliefs adapted. Beneath the ruins of Mexico City, the stones of Tenochtitlan remain, silent witnesses to a world that once believed sacrifice held the universe together. After the fall, survival, memory, and what endured. The fall of Tenochtitlan did not end the Aztec people. It ended Aztec sovereignty. In the ruins of the city, survivors gathered among broken temples and flooded streets. Spanish banners replaced sacred standards. Churches rose where pyramids once stood. The old gods were declared demons. Their rituals were forbidden. Their priests were silenced or executed. Yet beneath the surface, Aztec society adapted rather than vanished. The Spanish crown moved quickly to reorganize the conquered world. Tenochtitlan became Mexico City, capital of New Spain. Indigenous nobles who cooperated were allowed limited authority, ruling their communities under Spanish oversight. Tribute systems were repurposed. Labor obligations continued under new names. Conquest changed the masters, but not the burden. Franciscan and Dominican missionaries arrived in waves. They learned Nahuatl, recorded oral histories, and worked to convert the population. Some were brutal iconoclasts. Others attempted understanding, preserving what they could even as they dismantled belief systems. Ironically, much of what is known about Aztec culture survives because of these early missionaries. Codices were burned by the thousands, but some were copied or rewritten in alphabetic Nahuatl. Indigenous scribes adapted, embedding their worldview inside Christian frameworks. Gods became metaphors. Rituals became folklore. Memory went underground. Disease continued its devastation. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza reduced the population by millions within decades. Entire villages vanished. Fields lay abandoned. Social structures fractured. Trauma reshaped identity. For survivors, the old cosmology no longer explained reality. The world had not ended, but it had been conquered. Aztec warriors became laborers. Priests became teachers or healers. Women carried traditions through household ritual and language. Nahuatl remained spoken, passed from parent to child, even as Spanish dominated administration. Cultural survival was quiet and deliberate. Some traditions transformed. Festivals merged with Catholic saints' days. Offerings became prayers. Sacred landscapes retained meaning under Christian names. The logic of reciprocity, giving to receive, persisted beneath new symbols. The psychology of sacrifice changed, but the sense of obligation endured. The Spanish exploited Aztec labor through encomienda systems, forcing communities into mines, farms, and construction. Resistance continued, through rebellion, escape, and cultural. Yet memory proved resilient. By the late colonial period, indigenous scholars like Fernando Alvarado Tezazomac and Camalpin recorded Aztec histories from within the new order. Their works preserved genealogies, wars, and cosmology, filtered but not erased. The Aztecs began to exist as history. In modern Mexico, their legacy became national identity. The eagle and serpent returned, not as religious symbols, but as emblems of origin. Tenochtitlan's ruins were excavated beneath the capital. Museums replaced temples. History replaced ritual. But reduction came with distortion. Popular portrayals often fixated on human sacrifice, ignoring philosophy, law, science, poetry, and resilience. The Aztecs were labeled as savages or victims, rarely as complex actors within their own world. The truth is harder. They built an empire through domination and fear. They practiced ritual violence at industrial scale. They also created art, law, education, and meaning within a coherent worldview that endured for centuries. Their fall was not inevitable, but it was shaped by rigidity. A system that depends on cosmic certainty struggles when the cosmos stops responding. The Aztecs faced an unprecedented collision of disease, technology, and global expansion. No prophecy could prepare them for microbes or cannons. Yet even in defeat, they adapted. Their descendants remain. Nahuatl is still spoken by over 1 million people. Agricultural practices endure. Concepts of reciprocity, community, and sacred landscape persist in subtle ways. The Aztec world did not end. It transformed through pain, survival, and memory. The fifth sun did not collapse into darkness. It faded into history, leaving behind lessons about power, belief, and the fragile balance between meaning and reality. Forgotten truths, power, faith, and the shape of collapse. The Aztecs did not disappear because they were weak. They fell because their strengths became rigid. At their height, the Aztecs built one of the most sophisticated states in the pre-modern world. They organized massive populations without metal tools, draft animals, or written alphabets. They governed through law, ritual, education, and fear. They sustained a cosmic system that gave meaning to suffering and purpose to death. For centuries, it worked. The Aztec worldview explained everything: war, famine, success, loss, through balance and obligation. Humans fed the gods. The gods sustained the sun. The sun sustained life. This cycle justified sacrifice, hierarchy, and conquest. But belief systems that explained everything often struggled to adapt to anything new. The arrival of the Spaniards was not just a military shock. It was a philosophical rupture. Horses, steel, and guns could be understood as weapons. Disease could not. Smallpox did not fit into ritual calendars. It did not respond to sacrifice. It did not respect rank, virtue, or devotion. For the first time, suffering had no meaning. Aztec power relied on predictability. Tribute systems functioned because consequences were known. Rituals mattered because outcomes were expected. When results stopped aligning with belief, authority weakened at every level. This is the hidden truth of the collapse. The Aztecs did not lose faith too slowly. They lost it too suddenly. Moctezuma's hesitation is often portrayed as weakness or superstition. In reality, it reflected the paralysis of a ruler trapped between incompatible realities. Acting aggressively risked offending the gods. Waiting risked political destruction. Every choice violated some sacred logic. No system had prepared him for a godless threat. The Spanish conquest succeeded not because Europeans were destined to win, but because they entered a fractured psychological landscape. Indigenous allies did not fight for Spain. They fought against Aztec domination. Disease erased resistance faster than armies. Betrayal traveled faster than belief. Collapse came from inside as much as outside. And yet, it is too easy to reduce the Aztecs to sacrifice and failure. This fixation hides what endures. Aztec society valued education for all children. It emphasized discipline, responsibility, and service. Poetry and philosophy explored impermanence, grief, and the search for truth. Their scholars questioned whether anything in life was real or lasting, a haunting insight from a civilization built on cosmic certainty. They were not blind to impermanence. Their greatest contradiction was knowing that the world would end, while believing they could delay it forever. In modern narratives, the Aztecs are often judged by moral frameworks that did not exist in their world. Human sacrifice horrifies contemporary audiences, but within Aztec logic, it was reciprocal, not cruel. Violence was sacred, not chaotic. Death was not annihilation, but transformation. Understanding does not require approval. What the Aztecs teach is not how to rule, but how power behaves when belief hardens into law. Empires that rely on fear eventually exhaust it. Systems that demand absolute obedience struggle when reality shifts. Worldviews that explain everything leave no space for adaptation. These patterns repeat across history. The Aztecs remind us that collapse is rarely sudden. It is prepared slowly, by rigidity, overconfidence, and a refusal to imagine alternatives. When the breaking point arrives, it feels instant only because the warning signs were invisible to those inside the system. Even after conquest, Aztec culture did not vanish. It transformed. Language endured. Memory survived. Identity adapted. What could bend lived on. What could not broke. This is the final forgotten truth. Civilizations do not die because they are wrong. They die because they cannot change fast enough. The Aztecs were builders of meaning in a fragile universe. They believed sacrifice held the sun in the sky. When the sun kept rising without their rituals, the world they knew lost its foundation. But humanity remained. Beneath modern Mexico City, the stones of Tenochtitlan still rest. They do not speak of gods or conquest. They speak of people who tried desperately to give order to chaos, meaning to suffering and structure to existence. Their story is not a warning against belief. It is a reminder that belief must move with the world or be buried beneath it.